Rob Harris set up Ramidus Consulting, the built environment research and advisory consultancy, in 2003. Its clients are developers, investors, occupiers, and public sector bodies. He's just published a book, London's Global Office Economy from Clerical Factory to Digital Hub, and it's a timely and comprehensive study of the office from the very beginnings of the workplace to its post-pandemic future. So, Rob, in your book, you show a very interesting graph illustrating the reduction in demand for office space from the sort of formal meeting spaces and allocated desks of the 1990s through to the co-working and bookable spaces of today. Yet we're still seeing plenty of investment interest in new offices in the city at the moment. So where's that demand coming from, do you think?
Yeah, you're absolutely right to draw attention to the diagram, because there is a paradox there, isn't there? On the one hand, companies are reducing their space. They're doing that in response to economic pressures, obviously, and they have been doing that for 20 odd years now. I remember back in the before all this started, we were occupying offices at around 18 square meters a head, and now the average certainly in a new office is around 9 square meters. We've actually halved density in offices. Oh, sorry, I should say doubled density in offices over a period of 20 odd years. And that's been an interesting process. And in response, office environments have changed. So we've had this switch from serried rows of clerical office workers, if you like, through to these more nuanced environments around what some people call agile working or activity-based working. But overall, companies' footprints have been shrinking. So you'd think, wouldn't you, that naturally London would shrink. But of course, there's a much bigger process taking place, isn't there? And that's what this book is about, in essence. It's about the shift from a manufacturing economy to a service economy, and then now to a knowledge economy. And that's what this book traces over a couple of hundred years from the Industrial Revolution. And the point about that is that since the war, certainly the last war, the mid 20th century, we moved into an era which the book refers to as the corporate office, where we had huge corporations evolve globally, particularly from America, employing many hundreds of thousands of people. And the whole concept of company man evolved at that time, didn't it? With anonymous men mainly, all dressed the same, going to the same office 9 to 5, and company man was born. And that corporate office lasted through to about 1985 or somewhere around then, when we introduced office technology, the PC, the laptop, and so on and so forth. We moved into the digital office. And the point about that is that the economy's been reinventing itself. And so instead of having a net loss of jobs, we've had a net increase in jobs because the knowledge economy has grown. Over the past 20 or 30 years, London's industrial economy has shrunk by 90%, 90%. And that's been replaced in large part by the growth of the office economy. Other things, of course, leisure economy and so on. But the office economy has been fundamental to that growth. And we've seen new growth. So whilst financial services underpinned growth in the 80s, we've since then had the creative and digital sectors, the media sector, life sciences more recently, higher education. All these things have grown in terms of increasing the office economy. So whilst individual companies are reducing their footprints to become more economic and more efficient, the office economy as a whole has grown enormously over the past period of time. So that's the answer to the paradox: company shrinkage, but economic growth.
So in the present context, how do you see people coming back to work, and who'll decide whether they work at home or in the office? I mean, you write in the book about a balance between corporate and individual perspective. So what do you think that right balance is?
Well, there isn't a right balance. That's the first thing. There is no single answer to this. And each company will make up its mind. Each organization will make up its own mind as to what its solution is. There is no cookie cutter solution around the corner. So that's the first point. I think the second point is that there's always been a tension between employer and employee. You know, in industrial context, we've had that, context of industrial strife, haven't we? But even in the office, in the post-war period again, there's been this tension between the company and the worker. Frank Duffy drew attention to this in the early 80s even the late 70s, in fact, when he was talking about the organic workplace and how you need to think about people in that, the software of people in that context of the hardware of the office. And so it's very much about understanding the tension between the corporate organization and the individual worker. Now, the tension has been very much, it's been the case in the past that the power, if you like, has been with the employer, pulling people into the office, 9 to 5, line of sight management, and so on and so forth. That was breaking down before the pandemic. A lot of people were doing agile working at that point, related to my previous discussion about the knowledge economy. A lot more agile workers, knowledge workers doing their own thing in a wider sense. The pandemic has demonstrated we can do that kind of work more widely in the economy, and managers have learned some lessons from that. So I think the answer to your question is that whilst there's no cookie cutter answer, no single answer, there will be a whole variety of responses to this in which there's a mediation between employer and employee about who needs to do what. You know, it's very well for you know, for highly independent self-starters to say this is the future. Compare that to, for example, a local authority environment where people are doing process-based work. You know, the two things are very different. Within our offices, people are doing very different kinds of work, and that has to be recognised in this understanding of the balance of who comes back. But I also want to raise a point here, which is, I think, is a really, really important one, which nobody, so far as I can tell, is really recognising, and that's about social justice. And the point here is that yes, some of us can choose. You know, I live in I'm a remote worker. I do agile working, but I'm also quite old, and I've got my experience behind me. I've done my social networking. I've built my relationships, and that's fine. It suits me. But you know, for other demographics, it doesn't. And there's an issue about social justice here in terms of demographics, but also between the economy more widely. Because I expect somebody to come here on a Sunday morning, having ordered something on Saturday afternoon, you know, using a 0-hour contract to deliver something to me the next day. You know, I expect to go to the supermarket and buy food. I don't do this, but we as a society, 24 hours a day, and so on and so forth. You know, there's hospitals, there's education. You know, flexibility is in the eye of the beholder. And yes, so office workers, some of them can do it, but many can't throughout the wider economy. So there's a social justice question about what we think is appropriate and right. And I don't think that question is being asked widely enough at the moment. It's very much about what I want from my workplace and where I want to be, as opposed to what we should be doing as a company, as an organization, as a society. So it's a bit serious, that one, but I feel very strongly about it.
Yes, but I had an interesting conversation with Patrick Wong of Tenacity, who's got 2 towers, who just got planning permission in the City of London. And he was talking about the demand for offices in the city in the future. And he was saying, well, right at the moment, a lot of companies with you know, looking to cut costs are saying, yes, let's get rid of office space. But actually, in a few years' time, they'll change their tune and want to come back into offices in a bigger way. Do you think he's right?
Well, he would say that, wouldn't he? I mean, fair enough. He's providing space. That's his business. I happen to think he's half right. I do, actually. In my heart of hearts, with all the research I've done, with all the thinking I've done, I think there will be a more widespread return to the office more days a week than is being currently anticipated in certain environments and certain corridors. The office is a great leveler. You know, if you go back to, again to my book, if you go back to the sort of 18th century and so on, we had clerical factories, and conditions in those offices were almost as bad as they are in you know, mines and quarries and things. But the office, certainly in the latter part of the 20th century, it became a much more human environment, much more accepting. And in the noughties, you know, we learned about well-being, we learned about environmentalism, we learned about and the office was becoming a much more acceptable environment to be in, and a much more pleasant environment to be in. And my concern at the moment is that we're going to throw the baby out the bathwater. We made so much progress with the office environment that, you know, we're in danger of saying, well, chucking that, let's get rid of all that. Because, you know, it's a great leveler, as I say. And whether you were a starter or a CEO, the modern office treated you pretty much the same. I mean, there were different privileges and obviously different salaries and so on, but in terms of the environment and the welcome and the experience, you're treated pretty much the same. And to my mind, that's a really good thing, because we all have different domestic situations and so on and so forth. And I see that the leveling process of the office as being a really important aspect. Again, it's not really widely discussed, but yeah. So I think he's half right. I hope he's more right than wrong. But there will be some short-term disruption, that's for sure.
So in the book, you talk about the office of the future as a blend of business and domestic design attributes tailored to individual requirements. Can you elaborate a bit on that? I mean, it sounds to me a bit like Hermann Hertzberger's Central Bahia offices, which was designed back in the 1960s. And of course, I mean, you used to work with DGW and Frank Duffy, and I always felt Hermann Hertzberger had a very special place in their hearts in terms of having designed one of the sort of great offices of the world, really.
Well, they say there's nothing new in the world, don't they? And again, it's a lesson from the book. You know, I paint a picture of 5 ages of the office, from coffee house to clerical factory, to digital office, to network office. And you know, the future network office has more similarities to the original coffee house economy than it does to anything in between. And that's what I'm saying about this domestic versus company thing, because the new office, I hate that phrase, the new office, but the emerging office is all about the individual, about experience, about welcoming. It's about well-being. It's about all these things that we've been craving for a very long time. And back in the day, whilst we didn't have those things in the coffee houses, they were about individuals. They're about knowledge exchange. They're about people meeting to greet and to understand and to gather intelligence. And that's what the new office is about. You know, it's not about the corporate office of the 60s and company man that I mentioned earlier. We've got thousands of people doing the same job with, you know, minuscule grades of seniority between them. It's about individuals who come to an office to understand, to collaborate, to think, to teach, to mentor, and all those good things. So that's what I mean, that it's becoming much more about almost like a domestic setting where people feel comfortable and in their environment, as opposed to coming at 9 o'clock to process something and leave at 5 o'clock unsatisfied and fairly well unrewarded, actually. So that's what that's about. I think it's about the change that's taking place. But also, I think that, going back to my point about corporate organizations, SMEs are massively important in our economy now, especially the knowledge economy. I set up a business, you set up a business, anybody can set up a business, and you can trade globally as an individual or as 1 or 2 or 3 people. SMEs are now critical to everything we're doing. And so the office environment is much more tailored now around small organizations than it is about large corporate organizations. This is where the flexible markets made its debut and success. People like Tog, you know, providing these kinds of environments that people, you know, really want to be in. So that, again, that's the point. It's about smallness as well as greatness, and that's the point about domestic and versus corporate in the Hertzberg environment. Yeah, so there's nothing new. We're moving around in circles to some extent, but learning all the way. And, you know, things like that, the well-being agenda, for example, are, you know, part of that learning process that come in, which we didn't have before. So good things as well.
So now we've sort of moved from a digital economy to a network economy, as you say, which is going to reveal itself in very different sorts of ways in the city of the future, sort of variety of hubs and spokes, which you illustrate in your book. So how do you see the shape of London a decade or so from now in that situation?
Well, I'm going to be controversial here. I think the hub and spoke model has failed before it starts. I don't see that as a future. Just to be clear, what we mean by hub and spoke, the idea here is that you have a central office in the CBD somewhere, and out in the sticks somewhere, you have a spoke office where people come to work each day. So that's what we're talking about. No, that's failed before it started, because it works in Tokyo, it can work in Los Angeles, it can work in San Fran, because you got huge metropolises there with concentrations of people out in the burbs. London and European cities work very differently. We don't have those concentrations of people out in the burbs. I'm working for a financial services business at the moment who are based in the West End. They've got 300 people and they've got to relocate. So one of the first things we did was look at the postcodes of their workers, where they live. It's like a 5-year-old throwing darts at a dartboard. They're all over. So, that company cannot say, we're going to set up a spoke in Chelmsford or Woking or Reigate, because they get 2 people go there. So I don't think that hub and spoke works in a European city context. What I think is going to happen is that London will change quite dramatically insofar as it'll become what we refer to in the book as a metropolis. So whilst it's got this necklace of green belt around it, which as far as I can tell is going to be there forever until the next ice age, beyond that, we're going to have activity which will make sure that the southeast of England and beyond becomes operates more of a metropolis, rather like some American cities. We saw just yesterday, for example, that I think it was Goldman Sachs are setting up an office in Birmingham. They call it a technology center. I don't know what that means. It's probably to do with fintech development or something. But the point is they're going to put 200 or 300 people in Birmingham to do that. Now, I don't know the inside argument in the business case for doing it, but I would guess it's to do with the fact that Birmingham has a very large labour market. Chelmsford, Reigate, Woking don't. So, Birmingham's got a big labour market. They can go there, they can choose. It's got capacity in terms of buildings, modern buildings, and it's got transport. Those smaller towns around the M25, for these so-called nodes, they have none of those things. Now, it might be the case that some large companies offer their staff memberships to, serviced office occupiers, but, that's an interesting one. And I'm also concerned about the environmental arguments here, because it's widely assumed, and I use that term correctly, that working from home is more environmental than working in a CBD. I'm not entirely convinced by that. I used to live in Woking in Surrey, and you get 726 to Waterloo, like 1,000 other people did. And I think that's more sustainable, especially if we can improve train technology, than having 1,000 people driving around Surrey countryside looking for a serviced office in the morning, or indeed heating 1,000 homes in the winter. So I'm not entirely convinced that the environmental or social or economic arguments around hub and node stack up. I'm really not. That's my point on that one, I think.
But then there has been a long-term spread, really, of, there was a time before Big Bang when any finance company had to be within, or any bank at least had to be within 5 minutes walk of the Bank of England. And of course that all changed, and you had Canary Wharf, obviously, you had Salomon Brothers moving to Victoria.
Oh yeah.
And others moving further out, and which of course is a repeat of what Croydon was all about back in the 1960s. So that spread from the centre, it has been happening.
No, it has been happening. You're correct, but there's also been the opposite effect happening before COVID, certainly post global financial crisis. There's very strong evidence of companies moving back into the centre. To be where the action is in shorthand, to be where employment, young people, talent, and so on. There's many examples of companies that have moved back in. The companies that moved out that you're referring to, largely during the 70s and 80s, they moved back offices out. They moved large clerical functions out to Croydon, to Reigate, Redhill, these places. That's all gone. Those jobs have gone. They're not coming back. So and in those days, you used to have something called a London waiting, which is where you got paid quite a lot more in central London than you did in Croydon. And so it's in companies' interest to send staff out, reduce their wages bill, and everything was done, because people were using typewriters and, but that's all gone. So the move of back offices has disappeared. Front offices are coming back in, and some offices are moving further away. But within London itself, there's a different pattern happening, because outer London is emptying of offices. You got your Hillingdons, your Enfields, your Suttons. Offices are just disappearing hand over fist, and the centre of London's getting more dense but larger. The CBD is growing. It's growing to the South Bank, down to Battersea now with Apple, down through Waterloo, out through more London east. The CBD is getting bigger, but it's also getting denser. So outer London's emptying of offices. Central London's becoming more dense, and bigger cities further afield are going to benefit from the Goldman Sachs type move. I do not see spokes opening up in M25 centres to accommodate a new way of working.
Fascinating. Well, thank you very much, Rob, for those insights. They're great, and thanks for the book, which I found very readable and
Thank you.
incredibly comprehensive. So I'm sure it will become a classic. So thank you very much.
You're too kind. Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much.